In Book 4 of Paradise Lost, Milton had sketched the origins of human freedom. And you remember this. Eve's first memory, her reflection on her reflection in the pool, had established the importance of freedom and also the importance of independence for not only her relation with Adam, but essentially all human relations. So Milton's concern in Book 4 was to establish something like the viability of a freedom that was able, in some way, to coexist with what we discussed, was a hierarchical set of power relations. And this coexistence of freedom on the one hand and social hierarchy on the other is something that this poem continues to assert. And I would also add that it's something that this poem continues to worry about. It's an extraordinarily problematic but crucial element of Paradise Lost. Now, I want to review a couple of moments in Book 4. Think back to what Eve had told Adam after she had been compelled by him, and also by the warning voice, after she had been compelled to channel all of her erotic energies away from the beautiful, sympathetic, responsive, watery image toward Adam. And Eve had said, "Thy gentle hand seized mine, I yielded." Thy gentle hand seized mine, I yielded. And there's a continual dance of seizing and yielding. You have his assertion of power and her gracious resignation. And through, although it's a gentle use of power on the one hand, and it's an independent and consensual resignation on the other. And through this dance, Milton, I think, was trying to establish a model of human interaction really distinct from simple coercion, or completely distinct from simple coercion. It's distinct from the simple exercise of brute force that I think we often associate with life in a hierarchically organized society. And human interaction in this poem is founded on a principle of consent. In the Miltonic Commonwealth of Eden, and we can think of it as a commonwealth, no one can be forced to act. Eve has to choose to act. She has to consent to act. She yields, which is for Milton not actually a resignation. It's a positive, deliberate action, and she has the right of consent because she possesses for Milton an inalienable capacity for free will and free choice. So this account of Eve's first exercise of free will, the one that I've just given you, her yielding to Adam when he seizes her hand, that's at least, I think, the official one that the poem urges us to accept. According to the poems, what I'm thinking of as the poem's official philosophy, because it seems to be guaranteed or in some way subtended by the narrator and authoritative forces in the poem. According to this philosophy, Eve yields to Adam freely and willingly because she comes to recognize his superior nature. And the poem presses on us a philosophy whereby Eve's freedom is entirely compatible with the fact of, or what we're asked to take as the fact of her inferiority to Adam. And Satan himself explains perfectly this philosophy. And I think he gives us, ironically, it's Satan who gives us the best formulation of this coexistence of freedom and hierarchy in the poem, that freedom and hierarchy are absolutely compatible. Satan will tell Abdiel in Book 5, "For orders and degrees jar not with liberty, but well consist. We can in reason or in right assume monarchy, or who can in reason or in right assume monarchy over such as live by right his equals, if in power and splendor less, in freedom equal." But Milton's poetry, well, think how odd it is, first of all, that it's Satan who's giving us something like the only carefully articulated authoritative position on this, to say the least, this controversial matter. Milton's poetry is invariably more sophisticated than what we can think of as the official dogma or the authoritative line of the poem. Perhaps that fact is revealed or exposed to us by the fact that it's Satan who's giving us, in this instance, the authoritative line. It's important to keep this distinction in mind, because this poem simply cannot be reduced. Sometimes it tries to be reduced, but it cannot be reduced to those ringing declarations of what sound like the official positions of the poem. So think how complicated it is with Eve. Eve's account of that beautiful poolside reverie was so filled with pathos and longing that it's impossible, I think, not to feel at least a little bit of disappointment when she consents finally to her union with Adam. It's almost, I don't know, there's kind of a sense in which she's sold out. As, of course, we're happy that she has a mate who's another person and not merely a smooth, watery image. Nonetheless, there's a sense of disappointment that attends that choice that she makes. And initially for Eve, I'm at least convinced, there seemed to be nothing like freedom at all. She remembers having gazed at that pleasing image in the reflective pool, and she recalls being pulled away from that smiling and sympathetic image by that mysterious voice that had guided her to Adam. And I think this is one of the most moving lines in the entire poem. When Eve recalls the feeling of helplessness that she experienced when she heard that voice. And this is how she explains it later to Adam. What could I do but follow straight, invisibly thus led? What could I do? And not a bad question. What could she do? The subordination of woman to man in heterosexual union in Paradise Lost seemed entirely compulsory at that moment. And Eve, it seemed, on some level had to be coerced to unite herself with this less pleasing Adam. And Milton, for a moment at least, Milton seemed to be on the brink of something like a powerful critique of the so-called naturalness of normative sexual behavior, because there's at least some suggestion here that Eve's attraction to Adam was not freely chosen at all. It was chosen for her. It was assigned to her. And all of this is a way of saying that Milton is doing something extraordinarily complicated in Paradise Lost. He's juxtaposing, and he does this consistently. He juxtaposes the rhetoric of rational consent on the one hand with the competing rhetoric of coercion. And maybe that word's a little strong, but a competing rhetoric of something like a gentle compulsion, if that oxymoron makes any sense. There's a way in which this entire scene, which is intended to assert the politics of rational consent, provides at the very same moment something like a critique of the politics of rational consent. We know that Eve's freely willed act of yielding followed in time Adam's exertion of force. And so however gentle Adam is, thy gentle hand seized mine, he still seized Eve. And Milton's, I think, remarkably honest. So this is why I'm always pushing you to agree with me. I'm compelling you to agree with me that Milton deserves a little bit of credit here. And Milton's amazingly honest in his account of Eve's first exercise of her free will. And I think we can think of this as her first free act. And of course, it is an unduly circumscribed act of freedom. And Milton's poetry, in a lot of ways, is constantly questioning the legitimacy of a doctrine of free will in a world that has been arranged and conjugated like the one that Eden has been. It's along a principle of hierarchy. So, Book 4 had explored in extraordinary detail the complexities of hierarchy and freedom with respect to the relation between the sexes. And Book 5 is also interested in the relation, this uneasy but important relation between hierarchy and freedom. It's almost as if Book 4 hadn't sufficiently put to rest the logical problem that on some level is constantly eating away at the center of the poem. And so Book 5 takes up this problem once again. But it takes it up, as we of course should have been led to expect, it takes it up from an entirely different perspective. So, as I just said, in Book 4, the hierarchical principle of superiority and of excellence was the superiority of man to woman. In Book 5, the central hierarchical axis is a little different, or a lot different. It involves the superiority of angels over human beings. And this new hierarchical opposition, it's performing a lot of work, but one of the things that it's certainly doing is forcing us to rethink the hierarchical opposition that Milton had established in Book 4. And that's because hierarchy is no longer gendered in book 5. Milton's not concerned here with sex. He's concerned rather with degrees of materiality among all of God's creatures. Angels are less material, less corporally burdened creatures than Adam and Eve, and therefore, within this system, therefore they're superior. And in this larger vision of a kind of cosmic principle of hierarchy, in which lighter, more ethereal things are superior to heavier, denser, grosser material things, we can see a way in which a gender distinction simply drops out of the equation. Because Milton gives us no reason to think that Adam and Eve are anything but equal in the degrees of their corporeality. Sexual inequality simply seems insignificant here from this new perspective in Book 5. So Raphael descends into Eden, the archangel Raphael, in Book 5 in order to warn Adam and Eve not to eat the forbidden fruit. And in doing so, he provides an elaborate account of one of most, and I've already discussed this, but I have to discuss it again because for me, it's so outrageous and so daring and such an absolutely lovable religious heterodoxy. Maybe it's even a heresy, the heterodoxy of monism. And I'll remind you briefly of what monism is. It's the philosophy whereby there can be no such thing as a firm and absolute distinction between body and spirit. The world can't be divided into soul and matter as it could be divided with absolute clarity for Milton's contemporary Descartes. The entire cosmos for Milton is made of one huge blob of matter, and this matter is nothing other ultimately than the body of God. And this is what Raphael explains to Adam at line 469 of Book 5. So this is page 313 in the Hughes edition. So this is Raphael to Adam. O Adam, one Almighty is, that's God, from whom all things proceed and up to him return, if not depraved from good. Created all such to perfection, one first matter all, endued with various forms, various degrees of substance, and in things that live of life. One first matter all. All things derive from the one first matter, which is, of course, God. And this is the ex Deo theory of creation, creatio ex Deo, as opposed to the orthodox theory of creation, which is creatio ex nihilo, the notion that God created the universe out of nothing. Milton has God creating the universe out of God himself, from the body of God. And in this ex Deo creation scenario, there's no qualitative difference but between the substance comprising men and the substance comprising angels. The difference is simply one of degree. This has been brilliantly argued by the critic William Kerrigan. It's a difference of degree rather than a difference of kind. Angels are simply lighter. The corporeal substance that makes up their bodies is more attenuated, it's more rarefied than that in human beings. And we are all more condensed. We're grosser creatures, to use Milton's one of Milton's favorite words here. Our grosser bodies are more compacted. They're of a denser consistency than the light and airy bodies of heavenly angels. And so except for this differentiation of degree the degree of substantiality, human beings and angels are qualitatively identical. That we're made of the same stuff. It's just how closely packed the stuff is. And Milton even treats us to a scene of Adam and Eve because it's thinkable in such a monistic universe, although it's wild, of Adam and Eve actually eating with the archangel Raphael. And this is I think this must have blown Milton's contemporaries away, because from any orthodox perspective, this attribution of what Milton would call a gross activity like eating to one of God's heavenly minions, one of the angels, would have to be seen. If it's not blasphemous, it's certainly indecorous. But this is of course a poem that's centered around an illicit act of eating, and so Milton will turn the entire activity of eating into the premise of an entire philosophy of the relation of human creatures to their God. So in that all of God's creatures need to eat. Angels and men can be seen to be equals. And this is essentially Raphael's logic. Look at line 411 of Book 5. Raphael tells Adam, this is page 312, that angels are a lot like human beings. They hear, see, smell, touch, taste, tasting, concoct, digest, assimilate. And we're soon to learn that angels also have sex, because as we know, spirits can either sex assume or both. But we're about to find out here something I think that's a little more shocking even than the fact of angelic eroticism. Angels have digestive tracts in Milton's heaven. And like human beings, they have within their bodies some kind of mechanism for the elimination of ingested substances. The elimination of substances that cannot be assimilated into the body. So Milton's angels actually excrete. This is a remarkable feat of literary daring, to be sure, but it's also a magnificent feat of the human imagination on Milton's part. And so this is what the narrator seems to be referring to when he discusses Raphael's hunger. This is line 437. What redounds transpires through spirits with ease. It's so easy to miss. What redounds transpires through spirits with ease. What stays, what can't be assimilated into the body, gets expelled easily. Milton is so eager here. Now, we have to ask ourselves, why is Milton doing this? He's so eager, I'm convinced, to demonstrate the essential metaphysical equivalence of human beings and angels that he is quite prepared to ask us to imagine the unimaginable. Angels are exceedingly regular, Milton is telling us. What redounds, that food which remains in excess in the angel's body, transpires through spirits with ease. And of course, as we know, Milton was acutely interested in his own gastrointestinal tract, having blamed his blindness on a digestive problem. But there's a lot more here than merely a personal interest. Eating is so central to this poem that it's actually something like a digestive process of assimilation and excretion that would have enabled the unfallen Adam and Eve to become angels eventually themselves. Turn to line 493. This is page 313. It was to be Adam and Eve's good fortune to watch their own gross corporeal bodies slowly, gradually shed their dense matter as they assume the airy lightness of angels. And how will they attain this extraordinary achievement, this wafting up to heaven? They'll do it by eating. Look at line 493. Raphael's explaining that as things are now, angels are, in a pinch, angels are capable of a nutritional kind of condescension. They can eat the same food that human beings eat when they don't have a choice. And right now, Adam and Eve probably couldn't survive on angelic nectar if that's all they had to live on. Probably. But, Raphael adds, time may come when men with angels may participate and find no inconvenient diet nor too light fare. And from these corporal nutriments, perhaps, your bodies may at last turn all to spirit, improved by tract of time, and winged ascend ethereal as we, or may at choice here or in heavenly paradises dwell. And this is obviously the kicker, if ye be found obedient. Milton is going out of his way to provide Adam and Eve with a motive for remaining obedient by a simple process of eating, virtuous eating, virtuous digestion, and the consequent activity of the virtuous subliming, that's Milton's term, of gross matter into spirit. Adam and Eve will eventually, gradually, begin to ascend to the winged state of angelhood. They will metabolize themselves into angels. It's one of the most extreme visions and one of the most beautiful visions, however cockamamie, beautiful visions of human progress ever depicted, I think. So Raphael's account of the superiority of spiritual matter over gross matter is without question another one of the poem's hierarchical visions. But the amazing process of what we can think of as what would have been the angelization of men and women does something really quite alarming, I think, to the principle of hierarchy as it's been presented so far. The metaphysical hierarchy of the degree of material density, which is the concern of Book 5, isn't fixed. It's not static in Milton's universe. And Raphael this is a mobile society that Raphael is imagining. The hierarchy here is flexible. It's much more flexible than the gendered hierarchy was among human beings in Book 4. And if an Adam and Eve manage not to fall, they will arrive, we have to assume, equally at a state of angelic perfection, a state in which gender differences simply don't obtain, because angels, as we know, can either sex assume or both. There were a few other radical thinkers in the 17th century who embraced this vision of a monistic vision of the universe, like Milton's, and almost invariably, this monism had a kind of leftist, progressive, and in some cases actually a communist energy to it. I've written the name of one of Milton's contemporaries, Gerard Winstanley, who was England's first, maybe not England's first communist, but England's first important communist, writing 15 or so years before Paradise Lost. The bodies of all men and women are for Winstanley, as later for Milton, are equally infused with heavenly spirit and heavenly soul. And this, for Winstanley, Milton wouldn't permit himself to go quite this far. This physiological equality seemed to guarantee their political equality. And in adopting this doctrine of monism that had been developed or worked out by much more radical thinkers like Gerard Winstanley, Milton is really, on some level, consciously adopting a philosophy of body and spirit that works to undo. Maybe it works to undermine that patriarchal insistence on Adam's superiority over Eve. On some level, some of the philosophy in Book 5, I think, is working on a subterranean, at some subterranean stage to undermine or dismantle the Edenic, the paradisal hierarchy. So Adam and Eve before the fall are given the opportunity to reach their heavenly destinations on their own. Now, just think how radical that is when you compare it to any mainstream notion of the way Christianity works. Adam and Eve, had they never fallen, had they never sinned, would never have needed to rely on a God or a Messiah to intervene, an external redeemer to move in and save them, or even to reward them for their virtue. Their virtuous behavior would have been itself a reward. We can think of them as having been in a position almost to save themselves. And Milton is arriving at it's a wild and really daring alternative to the Orthodox Christian vision of redemption and salvation. And I think it's this Orthodox notion of Christianity that Milton always felt so uncomfortable with. Were it not for the fall, there would have been no need for the Heavenly Father to sacrifice the Son in order to save fallen humanity. Human beings would have been able to just waft up to the pearly gates like helium balloons, lighter even than air. No need for an external redeemer. In some ways, Milton is flirting with something like, and I think the children's or the young adult book writer Philip Pullman absolutely has put his finger on something important in Milton. He's a great reader and fan of Milton's. Is flirting with something that we would recognize as science fiction. It's a secular image of salvation, certainly, but it's a proto-scientific image of salvation. Unfallen salvation is something like a scientific process. It's the logical and inevitable result of just a particular type of virtuous natural behavior. And Milton arrives at a theology that does something that a theology is never supposed to do. It's a radical theology of bodily transformation that essentially does away with God, or does away with God as we know him. Who needs God? Adam and Eve will continue to eat. They'll eat virtuously. They'll be good people. They'll become angels. And eventually they will be subsumed into that universal ball of spiritual matter at that later point when God becomes all in all. That's that distant point in time where there will simply be no ontological difference between man and woman, between angel and man, or between us and God. So Raphael's philosophy of monism offers a truly radical vision of an exaltation. This prelapsarian notion of an exaltation of Adam and Eve up to heaven. They could have exalted themselves, and presumably we all could have exalted ourselves simply by being good, by doing it ourselves. But this vision, this daring vision of a radical self-determination couldn't possibly be more violently opposed to the version of exaltation that Raphael explains to Adam and Eve elsewhere in Book 5. This scene, I know you remember. Upon Adam's prompting, because it's so upsetting and so unforgettable. On Adam's prompting, Raphael goes on to describe the exaltation, the anointing of the Son of God. It's an event that comes as close to anything as explaining the very first mystery of the poem, which is the central mystery of the poem, that being the cause, the origin of Satan's fall. Now, the origin, and you can refer to your handy little chronology written by Alistair Fowler of events in Paradise Lost. The origin of Satan's fall is without question one of the most crucial problems that we have when we confront this poem. God's ways, on some level, God's ways can't be justified until the origin of man's fall can be explained or understood. And man's fall can't be understood or explained or justified until Satan's fall is explained. And so to account for Satan's fall, Milton relies, he makes all this up, and it's magnificent. He's relying here on the text of the second Psalm, a chapter of the Bible that he had himself translated into English in 1653. Now, the second Psalm imagines the Messiah speaking. This is that verse. The Lord to me hath said, thou art, it's the Son speaking. The Lord to me hath said, thou art my Son. I have begotten thee this day. And no one has ever known what to do with that passage from the second Psalms. The idea that the Messiah could actually remember the day that God had begotten him had for centuries, millennia, provided biblical commentators with a paradox that really bordered on the absurd. What could God have meant when he said, I have begotten thee this day? And Milton worries this problem of this begetting, and he does this throughout Paradise Lost, and he does it in a number of ways. He transforms this mysterious declaration that he has lifted from the second Psalm he's turned it into what is essentially the originary event of the entire poem. And so, as you can see from the chronology of the poem that Fowler gives us, the exaltation of the Son of God, and Fowler unfortunately calls him Christ. Milton's Son of God doesn't really function as a Christ. He's not. Milton would never in a million years, certainly, in Paradise Lost, call this fellow Christ. He doesn't call him Jesus either, because the Son of God isn't Jesus yet. He's pre-existent. But he's not a Christ, I think in part, because Milton doesn't want us to confuse or to construe this Son of God with anything that we've learned from any of our Sunday school classes or any exposure to traditional, Orthodox, mainstream Christian, Protestant, or Catholic thinking. This is the event. You'll remember how important first events are in Paradise Lost. This is the event that seems to have happened first. What occurred in heaven before this moment, the poem gives us no definitive clue. Although Satan knows there is something important that happened before this moment, and he makes an important conjecture about it prior to this. And we don't have time to look at this today. But you may want to study for yourself Satan's own theory of a first creation, and that's the creation of the angels. So God the Father assembles all of the angels. This is page 316 in the Hughes. book 5, line 600. And God delivers at line 600 a pronouncement that is, by any standards, absolutely shocking. Satan, like the other angels, was a son of God. But unlike the other sons of God, Satan had been one of the first archangels in heaven. And the narrator suggests, this is coming from the narrator, that Satan may have been the first archangel in heaven. First, both in God's favor and also in his general preeminence over the other angels. Because God liked him most, liked him best, and also because he was simply better than all of the other angels. And Milton continues his meditation on the multiple meanings here of first. Now, I'm going to read this passage to you, and you tell me if you think Satan might have just a teensy bit of a reason to be miffed at God's exaltation of another one of his sons, or what we have to assume is another one of his sons. This is God at line 600. Hear, all ye angels, progeny of light, thrones, dominations, princedoms, virtues, powers, hear my decree, which unrevoked shall stand. This day I have begot, whom I declare my only Son, and on this holy hill him have anointed, whom ye now behold at my right hand. Your head I him appoint, and by myself have sworn to him shall bow all knees in heaven, and shall confess him Lord. Under his great vicegerent reign abide united, as one individual soul forever happy. What's the tone of voice? I'm going to interrupt myself for a moment. How are we to imagine God pronouncing that word happy after what he's just told us? Under his great vicegerent reign abide united as one individual soul forever happy. Him who disobeys, me disobeys, breaks union, and that day, cast out from God in blessed vision, falls into utter darkness. This, of course, is a vision of an exaltation almost diametrically opposed to the exaltation of the unfallen Adam and Eve. They're wafting up. The Son of God, the Messiah, doesn't seem to have exalted himself along what has already been established is a recognizable pattern of a kind of natural physiological ascent. And you can imagine Milton he could have pulled that off. It's possible to imagine this, because he could pull off anything. It's possible to imagine a scenario whereby the Son had, on some level, eaten his way into God's favor and achieved the status of Messiah through an Adam and Eve-like virtuous metabolism and floating up to the very top of God's throne before any of the other angels. That's how damn good he was. But that's not the story that we get. According to the narrative we have, God the Father seems quite simply to have decided arbitrarily to appoint one of the angels over all of the others. Why has he done this? God does mention something about the Son's merit. Well, he will mention something about the Son's merit later in another scene of exaltation, but it's one that's already been narrated, and that's the scene that we've already read in Book 3. As for this moment right now, the motives for this declaration seem perfectly inexplicable, absolutely inscrutable, and it also seems clear that this inscrutability is the point of the Father's declaration. And as William Empson writes convincingly and brilliantly, although mischievously, in his wonderful book called Milton's God, the Father's declaration sounds like a challenge, like it's intended to be taken as a challenge. By saying, on this day I have begot the Messiah, God seems almost to be suggesting that, that he's just created this guy out of whole cloth for this very occasion. Just made him and raised this nobody to the rank of favorite. It's possible that God has just bequeathed all of his power to someone who hasn't even been around, someone who hasn't spent eternity paying his dues. What could God have been thinking? The Father knows this is an extraordinary thing to be declaring, and so he tries to soften the blow, I guess. This blow of this show of favoritism by inviting the other angels to abide under his great vicegerent reign, united as one individual soul, forever happy. And by individual, the Father means indivisible here. I'm convinced that the word individual, which only appears twice in Paradise Lost, is one of the poem's most important words. But it has its original meaning, its etymological meaning, which simply means it can't be divided. And this is, on some level, the Father seems to be making a stab at Milton's own monistic vision of egalitarianism. The angels will all be united as one individual soul. But the Father will only invoke this harmonious, indivisible union when? After he's placed the Son of God at the head of the other angels. And we're left to wonder just how we're supposed to reconcile this image of an indivisible egalitarianism with the competing image of an unyielding, rigorously enforced angelic hierarchy. And you can recognize in this scene the opposition of irreconcilables that we've already encountered, the ones that had characterized the power relations in Milton's Eden. Milton charges this scene in heaven with its power, I think, by juxtaposing just those two forces that he was continually attempting to unite in Book 4. He yokes together the principles of freedom and equality. Freedom and equality on the one hand, and the opposing principle